Okay, I think
Picture
this is
this.
it.
It's
Keep an eye
7:30
out.
a.m. on September 23, 2019, and Royal Canadian Mounted Police Constable Sarah McKinnon is driving her patrol car down the gravel access road to Kennedy Lake First Nation, a tiny Indigenous community on the remote northern tip of Vancouver Island, when she realizes something is absolutely wrong because there's no smoke coming from any of the chimneys despite the chilly morning air. As she walks through the eerily silent village, she finds breakfast still sitting on kitchen tables, coffee still warm in mugs, children's toys scattered in yards, and car keys hanging by front doors, but not a single human being anywhere to be found. All 35 residents of the community, including 8 children, had simply vanished into thin air sometime during the night, leaving behind their homes, their belongings, their vehicles, and even their beloved pets, as if they had all been simultaneously teleported to another dimension. The mystery of the Kennedy Lake disappearances would become the most baffling mass vanishing in Canadian history, with absolutely zero evidence, zero clues, and zero explanation for how an entire Indigenous community could disappear without a trace in the middle of one of the most isolated wilderness areas on Earth. This is the story of the most inexplicable mass disappearance in modern North American history, and what I'm about to tell you is going to keep you awake at night, because this isn't some urban legend or internet hoax. This is a real event that happened just 5 years ago, thoroughly documented by the RCMP, investigated by the Canadian government, and covered by major news outlets before mysteriously disappearing from public attention, when authorities realized they had absolutely no explanation for what had occurred. Let me take you back to September 22nd, 2019, the last normal day in the history of Kennedy Lake First Nation, a tiny Indigenous community that sat like a hidden secret in one of the most remote and beautiful locations in all of Canada. The village was located on the northern shore of Kennedy Lake, about 60 kilometers northwest of Tofino, on Vancouver Island, accessible only by a single gravel logging road that wound through dense temperate rainforest for over an hour from the nearest paved highway. Kennedy Lake First Nation was home to 35 members of the Nuu-chah-nulth people, an Indigenous group that had lived along the western coast of Vancouver Island for thousands of years. The community consisted of 12 small houses, a community center, a tiny general store, and a traditional longhouse where the elders held ceremonies and community meetings. The population included Chief Robert Clutesi, a respected 67-year-old leader who had guided the community for over 20 years, along with 8 families ranging from young couples with small children to elderly grandparents who had lived in the area their entire lives. The village was completely self-sufficient in many ways, with solar panels and a small hydroelectric generator providing power, a well system that drew clean water from underground springs, and gardens where residents grew traditional foods alongside modern vegetables. Most of the adult residents worked in a combination of traditional activities like fishing and hunting, along with modern employment in ecotourism, logging, and crafts that were sold to tourists in nearby Tofino. September 22, 2019 was a typical late summer day in the Pacific Northwest, with temperatures in the mid-teens Celsius and the kind of misty, overcast weather that was normal for the region during that time of year. The residents of Kennedy Lake went about their usual Sunday routines. Some attended a morning service at the small Christian church that had been built in the community center. Others spent time fishing on the lake or gathering traditional foods in the surrounding forest. Chief Clutes had spent the afternoon working on preparations for the upcoming salmon ceremony, an important traditional event that was scheduled to take place the following weekend. The ceremony would bring together Nuu-chah-nulth people from across Vancouver Island to celebrate the return of the salmon and give thanks for the abundance of the natural world. It was one of the most important events in the community's cultural calendar, and preparations had been ongoing for several weeks. Mary Clutesy, the chief's 34-year-old daughter, and the community's elementary school teacher, had spent Sunday evening preparing lessons for the 8 children who attended the small school she ran in one of the community center rooms. Mary was passionate about incorporating traditional Nuu-chah-nulth culture and language into the children's education, and she had been working on a special project about local wildlife that the kids were excited to present to their parents. Tommy Williams was a 28-year-old fisherman and hunting guide who lived with his wife Jennifer and their 2 young children ages 4 and 6 in a small house near the lake shore. Tommy had spent Sunday maintenance on his boat and fishing equipment, preparing for a group of tourists from Vancouver who were scheduled to arrive the following Thursday for a week-long fishing and cultural experience package. Elder Joseph Sam was 79 years old and one of the most respected knowledge keepers in the community. Joseph had been born in Kennedy Lake and had lived there his entire life, maintaining the oral traditions and cultural practices that connected the community to thousands of years of Nuu-chah-nulth history. On Sunday evening, Joseph had been working on a traditional canoe that he was carving for his great-grandson's naming ceremony, a project that had been occupying his time for several months. Dr. Amanda Chen was not a resident of Kennedy Lake, but she was an important figure in this story, because she was scheduled to arrive at the community on Monday morning, September 20, to begin a 3-month research project studying traditional ecological knowledge and its applications to modern environmental management. Chen was a professor of environmental science at the University of British Columbia, and she had received permission from Chief Cloutier and the Community Council to live in the village while conducting her research. Dr. Chen had visited Kennedy Lake several times over the previous year while developing her research proposal, and she had built strong relationships with many community members who were excited to share their traditional knowledge with someone who understood and respected Indigenous ways of understanding the natural world. The research project represented an important collaboration between the university and the First Nation that could potentially benefit both the academic community and the Indigenous community. On the evening of September 22nd, Dr. Chen was staying at a bed and breakfast in Tofino, about a 2-hour drive from Kennedy Lake, preparing for her early morning departure to the community. She had packed her research equipment, supplies for her 3-month stay, and gifts for the community members who had agreed to work with her on the project. Dr. Chen went to bed around 10:30 p.m., setting her alarm for 6 a.m. so she could make the drive to Kennedy Lake and arrive by around 8 a.m. for the welcoming ceremony that Chief Cloutier had planned. She fell asleep easily, excited about beginning the research project that represented the culmination of several years of relationship building and planning. Meanwhile, in Kennedy Lake, the community was settling into their normal Sunday evening routines. The weather had remained overcast but mild, with no wind and no precipitation. Perfect conditions for the kind of quiet evening that residents of remote communities treasured. Children were being put to bed after evening baths. Adults were reading or watching television on small screens powered by the community's solar battery system. And the elderly residents were enjoying the peaceful sounds of the lake and forest that surrounded their homes. Chief Cloutier had spent the evening reviewing documents related to upcoming negotiations with the provincial government about logging rights in the traditional territory. The paperwork was complex and time-consuming, but it was important work that would affect the community's economic future and environmental stewardship responsibilities. Chief Cloutier was known for his careful attention to detail and his commitment to protecting both the cultural and economic interests of his people. Around 9:30 p.m., several residents had gathered at the community center for their weekly Sunday evening social time, a tradition that brought neighbors together to share news, play cards, and maintain the social connections that were so important in a small community. The gathering included about 15 adults and a few older children, and the conversation covered everything from planning for the upcoming salmon ceremony to discussing the logistics of the research project that Dr. Chen would be starting the next day. By 10:30 p.m., the social gathering had wound down, and residents were heading back to their individual homes for the night. The community was quiet except for the normal sounds of the wilderness, owls calling in the distance, the gentle lapping of water against the lake shore, and the subtle creaking of trees in the light breeze that often picked up in the evening hours. Tommy Williams had been one of the last to leave the community center, stopping to chat with Chief Klutzy about the tourist group that was arriving later in the week. They discussed fishing conditions, weather forecasts, and the cultural presentations that would be part of the visitors' experience. Both men were looking forward to the opportunity to share their traditional knowledge and generate some income for the community through sustainable tourism. Elder Joseph Sam had gone to bed around 10:00 p.m. after spending the evening working on his canoe carving by lamplight in his small workshop behind his house. Despite his age, Joseph maintained a regular schedule of traditional craft work, and he found the rhythmic motions of carving to be both meditative and productive. He had made good progress on the canoe that evening, and was satisfied with the work he had accomplished. Mary Klutzy had stayed up until nearly 11:00 p.m., finishing her lesson plans for the coming week, and preparing materials for the wildlife project that her students were so excited about. She had been particularly focused on organizing a field trip to observe salmon spawning in the streams that fed into Kennedy Lake, an activity that would combine scientific observation with traditional knowledge about the relationship between her people and the salmon. By 11:00 p.m., Kennedy Lake First Nation had settled into the quiet rhythms of nighttime in a remote wilderness community. Most residents were asleep, though a few might have stayed up later reading or listening to music on headphones, so as not to disturb their neighbors. The community's dogs had settled down for the night, and even the outdoor cats that helped control rodent populations around the houses had found warm places to sleep. The night passed peacefully, with no unusual sounds, no disturbances, and no signs of any kind of emergency or crisis. The weather remained stable, with temperatures dropping into the single digits Celsius but staying well above freezing. There was no wind, no precipitation, and no atmospheric disturbances that might have indicated unusual environmental conditions. At 6:00 a.m. on September 23rd, Dr. Chen's alarm went off at her bed and breakfast in Tofino. She got up, showered, ate a quick breakfast, and loaded her supplies into her Toyota Prius for the drive to Kennedy Lake. Dr. Chen was excited and nervous about beginning her research project, and she spent the drive thinking through her plans for the first few days of work with the community. The drive from Tofino to Kennedy Lake normally took about 2 hours, over logging roads that wound through some of the most beautiful and pristine temperate rainforest in North America. Dr. Chen had made the drive several times before, but she was always amazed by the towering cedar and fir trees, the crystal clear streams, and the abundant wildlife that characterized this corner of Vancouver Island. At approximately 7:45 a.m., Dr. Chen's Prius reached the final stretch of gravel road that led to Kennedy Lake. First Nation. As she crested the small hill that provided the first view of the community, Dr. Chen immediately noticed that something was wrong. Despite the cool morning air that should have prompted residents to light fires in their wood stoves, there was no smoke rising from any of the chimneys in the village. Dr. Chen parked her car near the community center and got out to look around. The first thing that struck her was the complete silence. Even in a small, quiet community, there were usually some signs of morning activity. People starting vehicles, dogs barking, children playing, adults talking as they went about their morning routines. But Kennedy Lake was absolutely silent except for the natural sounds of wind in the trees and water lapping against the shore. Dr. Chen walked toward the community center expecting to find Chief Klutzy or other community members preparing for her arrival. The welcoming ceremony had been scheduled to begin at 8:00 a.m., and it was now nearly that time. But as Dr. Chen approached the building, she noticed that the doors were closed and there were no signs of any preparation or activity inside. Growing concerned, Dr. Chen decided to check some of the residential houses to see if she could find anyone who could explain what was happening. She walked to the nearest house, which belonged to Tommy and Jennifer Williams and their 2 children, and knocked on the front door. There was no answer, but Dr. Chen could see lights on inside the house, and she could hear what sounded like a radio or television playing. After knocking several more times without receiving any response, Dr. Chen tried the door handle and found that it was unlocked. She opened the door and called out, "Hello? Is anyone home? It's Dr. Chen from UBC." There was no response, so she stepped inside to look around. What Dr. Chen found in the Williams house would haunt her for the rest of her life. The family's breakfast was still sitting on the kitchen table. Bowls of cereal that were still soggy with milk, coffee that was still warm to the touch, and toast that showed no signs of having been sitting out for any significant period of time. Children's backpacks were sitting by the front door, apparently packed for a school day that would never come. In the living room, the television was still on, playing a morning children's program. Toys were scattered on the floor as if kids had been playing recently and had just stepped outside for a few minutes. Adult clothing was laid out on the master bedroom bed as if someone had been preparing to get dressed for the day. But there were no people anywhere in the house. Dr. Chen called out several more times, checked every room, and even looked in closets and under beds in the ridiculous hope that this might be some kind of elaborate prank or surprise. But it quickly became clear that the house was completely empty of human beings, even though every sign pointed to the family having been there just minutes earlier. Growing increasingly alarmed, Dr. Chen left the Williams house and went to check the next nearest residence, which belonged to Elder Joseph Sand. She found the front door unlocked, with similar signs of recent habitation, but no people. Joseph's morning coffee was still steaming on his kitchen counter, and his breakfast of scrambled eggs was still warm on a plate next to the stove. In Joseph's workshop behind the house, Dr. Chen found the canoe he had been carving, with wood shavings scattered around the base, indicating that he had been working recently. The carving tools were laid out neatly on his workbench, and there was even a thin layer of fresh wood dust on the floor that hadn't had time to settle or be disturbed. By this point, Dr. Chen was beginning to panic. She quickly walked through the entire community, checking every single house and building. In each location, she found the same inexplicable scene. Clear signs of recent human activity, but no human beings anywhere to be found. At Chief Klutzy's house, Dr. Chen found government documents spread across the kitchen table with a pen lying open beside them, as if he had been in the middle of reading and making notes when something had interrupted him. His morning coffee was still hot, and there was a half-eaten piece of toast with jam still sitting on a plate. Mary Klutzy's house contained lesson plans, laid out for the coming school day, with materials organized for the wildlife project she had been preparing. Her alarm clock showed that it had gone off at 6:30 a.m., and her clothes for the day were laid out on her bed. The shower in her bathroom was still damp, with wet towels hanging on the rack as if she had recently finished washing and preparing for the day. In house after house, Dr. Chen found the same pattern. Morning routines interrupted midstream, warm food and beverages, signs of normal activity from just minutes or hours earlier, but no people anywhere. Cars were still parked in driveways with keys hanging by front doors. Pets were still in the community, dogs wandering around looking confused and cats sitting in sunny spots as if waiting for their humans to return. At 8:30 a.m., Dr. Chen used her cell phone to call 911. The connection was poor because of the remote location, but she managed to reach an emergency operator and report that an entire community of 35 people appeared to have vanished overnight. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down and explain the situation," the operator said. "You're saying that people are missing?" "They're all missing," Dr. Chen said, her voice shaking. "All 35 residents of Kennedy Lake First Nation. I was supposed to meet with them this morning, and when I got here, everyone was gone. Their breakfasts are still warm. Their doors are unlocked. Their cars are here, but there are no people anywhere." The emergency operator had never received a call like this before, and it took several minutes of back and forth questioning before she understood the scope of what Dr. Chen was reporting. The operator immediately escalated the call to Royal Canadian Mounted Police Headquarters, and within minutes, multiple units were being dispatched to Kennedy Lake. Constable Sarah McKinnon was the first RCMP officer to arrive at Kennedy Lake, reaching the community at approximately 10:15 a.m. after a high-speed emergency drive from the detachment in Tofino. Constable McKinnon was a 12-year veteran of the RCMP with extensive experience in wilderness search and rescue operations, but nothing in her training had prepared her for what she found at Kennedy Lake. Dr. Chen met Constable McKinnon at the community center and quickly briefed her on what she had discovered. The two women then conducted a systematic search of the entire community, with Constable McKinnon documenting everything she observed while Dr. Chen provided background information about the residents and their normal routines. "I've never seen anything like this," Constable McKinnon radioed back to headquarters after completing her initial survey. "It's like everyone just vanished in the middle of their morning routines. There are no signs of struggle, no signs of any kind of emergency or evacuation. People just disappeared." Within 2 hours, Kennedy Lake was swarming with RCMP personnel, including detectives, forensic specialists, search and rescue coordinators, and communications experts, who were setting up equipment to manage what was clearly going to be a major investigation. The community was treated as a potential crime scene, with every building and vehicle photographed and cataloged before investigators began their detailed examinations. Staff Sergeant Michael Harrison was the lead investigator assigned to the Kennedy Lake disappearances. Harrison was a 20-year veteran of the RCMP with extensive experience in major crimes investigation, including kidnapping, human trafficking, and organized crime cases. But the Kennedy Lake situation was unlike anything in his experience or training. The first thing we had to rule out was some kind of mass evacuation or emergency relocation, Harrison explained to his team during their initial briefing. Maybe there was a gas leak, a landslide threat, a wildfire, something that would have prompted community leaders to evacuate everyone quickly without time to clean up or secure their homes. But investigators quickly determined that there had been no environmental emergency in the area. Weather records showed normal conditions, with no unusual atmospheric events. Geological surveys found no evidence of seismic activity, landslide risks, or ground instability. Air quality monitoring detected no toxic gases, chemical contamination, or other airborne hazards that might have prompted evacuation. The investigators also checked with all relevant government agencies, emergency services, hospitals, and transportation companies to see if there had been any kind of organized evacuation or mass relocation. No government agency had any record of contact with Kennedy Lake First Nation on September 22nd. No buses, trucks, boats, or aircraft had been chartered to remove people from the community. No hospitals or emergency shelters had received any influx of people from the area. More puzzling still, investigators found that the residents' personal vehicles were all still in the community, with keys readily available, and no signs that anyone had been preparing to leave. Suitcases and travel bags were still in closets and storage areas. Passports and identification documents were in drawers and personal belongings. If the residents had left voluntarily, they had taken nothing with them except the clothes they were wearing. The forensic examination of the scene provided even more puzzling details. There were no signs of violence or struggle anywhere in the community. No blood, no broken furniture, no scattered belongings that might indicate a fight or forced removal. Door locks were intact and showed no signs of tampering. Windows were all secure with no evidence of forced entry. Most significantly, there were no footprints or vehicle tracks leading away from the community that would indicate how 35 people might have left the area. The gravel roads and forest paths around Kennedy Lake would have shown clear evidence of any large group movement. But investigators found no such evidence, despite conducting extensive searches with trained tracking specialists. "It's like they all just vanished into thin air," Constable McKinnon reported to her superiors after 3 days of intensive searching. "We've covered every square meter of the community and the surrounding area for several kilometers in all directions. There's no evidence that these people went anywhere on foot, by vehicle, or by any other means of transportation. The search operation expanded rapidly. As the magnitude of the mystery became apparent, search and rescue teams with specially trained dogs were brought in to look for any trace of the missing residents. Helicopter crews conducted aerial surveys of the vast wilderness areas surrounding Kennedy Lake. Marine units searched the lake itself and the coastal areas that were accessible by water. Professional trackers, with decades of experience in wilderness search operations, joined the effort, using specialized techniques to look for any sign of human passage through the dense forest that surrounded the community. These experts were capable of detecting evidence of human activity that would be invisible to untrained observers. But they found absolutely nothing to indicate where the residents might have gone. The Canadian military was eventually called in to assist with the search, bringing sophisticated equipment including ground-penetrating radar, infrared imaging systems, and aerial reconnaissance capabilities. Military search specialists expanded the search area to cover hundreds of square kilometers of wilderness, but they found no trace of the missing residents. Dr. Patricia Wong was a forensic anthropologist from the University of British Columbia, who was brought in to examine the scene for any biological evidence that might provide clues about what had happened to the residents. Dr. Wong had extensive experience in analyzing crime scenes and mass casualty events, but the Kennedy Lake situation presented unique challenges. From a forensic perspective, this scene is almost impossibly clean. Dr. Wong reported after her initial examination. There's clear evidence of recent human habitation and activity, but no evidence of departure, removal, or harm. It's as if 35 people simultaneously ceased to exist without leaving any biological trace of their presence or absence. Dr. Wong collected samples of DNA evidence from personal belongings, hairbrushes, clothing, and other items that would allow investigators to identify the residents if their remains were ever found. But the more immediate question was whether there was any forensic evidence in the community that might explain how the disappearances had occurred. The forensic team found no evidence of any kind of chemical agent that might have been used to incapacitate the residents. There were no traces of drugs, sedatives, or toxic substances anywhere in the community. Food and water samples were analyzed and found to be completely normal, with no contamination or foreign substances. Electronic devices in the community were examined for any evidence of outside interference or communication that might have prompted the residents to leave. Cell phones, computers, radios, and television equipment all appeared to be functioning normally, with no signs of tampering or unusual activity. The investigation expanded to examine the residents' backgrounds for any possible explanations for a voluntary mass departure. Investigators looked into the community's finances, political affiliations, religious beliefs, and social connections to see if there might have been some reason for a planned relocation or evacuation. Chief Robert Cloutez was found to have been a respected community leader, with no history of criminal activity, mental health issues, or involvement in any kind of radical political or religious movements. His financial records showed normal income and expenses related to managing the community and his personal life. There was no evidence of any kind of debt, legal problems, or conflicts that might have motivated him to organize some kind of mass departure. The other residents were similarly found to have normal backgrounds, with no red flags that might explain a voluntary disappearance. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a remote but stable community, with jobs, family relationships, and community responsibilities that they had no apparent reason to abandon. The investigation also looked into the possibility that the disappearances might be related to the research project that Dr. Chen had been scheduled to begin. Investigators examined whether there might have been some kind of conflict or controversy about the research that could have prompted the community to leave rather than participate in the project. But interviews with Dr. Chen and review of her correspondence with community members showed that the research project had been welcomed by the residents, who were looking forward to the opportunity to share their traditional knowledge and potentially benefit from the collaboration with the university. There was no evidence of any opposition to the research or any concerns that might have motivated the community to disappear rather than participate. As weeks passed without any progress in the investigation, the RCMP began exploring increasingly exotic theories about what might have happened at Kennedy Lake. The sheer completeness of the disappearances, combined with the total lack of any conventional evidence, forced investigators to consider possibilities that they would normally dismiss as impossible. One theory that received serious consideration was that the residents might have been the victims of some kind of coordinated kidnapping or human trafficking operation. The remote location of Kennedy Lake would have made it possible for criminals to operate without being observed. And the Indigenous community might have been targeted because of their isolation and vulnerability. But this theory fell apart when investigators realized that any kidnapping operation large enough to remove 35 people simultaneously would have required extensive planning, multiple vehicles, and a large number of perpetrators. Such an operation would have left substantial physical evidence, tire tracks, footprints, dropped items, signs of struggle that simply weren't present at Kennedy Lake. Moreover, kidnapping or trafficking operations are motivated by profit, and there was no evidence that anyone had demanded ransom for the missing residents or that they were being held for any kind of economic exploitation. The complete absence of any communication from kidnappers or criminals made this theory increasingly unlikely. Another theory considered by investigators was that the residents might have been the victims of some kind of environmental disaster or contamination that had either killed them or forced them to flee. The remote location and pristine wilderness environment might have concealed some kind of industrial accident, chemical spill, or natural phenomenon that had affected the community. Environmental specialists were brought in to conduct extensive testing of air, water, soil, and vegetation around Kennedy Lake. The testing looked for everything from industrial chemicals and radioactive contamination to naturally occurring toxic substances that might be found in the forest ecosystem. But the environmental testing found absolutely no evidence of any kind of contamination or hazardous conditions in the area. Air quality was excellent, water sources were clean and safe, soil samples showed normal composition for the region, and vegetation showed no signs of disease or contamination. The possibility of some kind of natural disaster was also thoroughly investigated. Geological experts examined the area for evidence of landslides, sinkholes, or other ground failures that might have affected the community. Hydrological specialists looked at whether flooding, drainage changes, or water-related disasters might have occurred. But the geological and hydrological surveys found no evidence of any kind of natural disaster or environmental change that could explain the disappearances. The Kennedy Lake area was geologically stable with no history of significant seismic activity or ground failure. Water levels and drainage patterns were normal for the season with no indication of flooding or other water-related problems. As the investigation entered its third month without any significant progress, the RCMP was forced to acknowledge that they were dealing with a completely unprecedented situation. The disappearance of 35 people without any physical evidence or logical explanation represented a mystery that challenged fundamental assumptions about how such events occur. The case began attracting attention from researchers who specialized in unusual disappearances and anomalous phenomena. Dr. James Morrison was a psychologist from the University of Toronto who had studied mass disappearances and collective behavior, and he was brought in to consult on the Kennedy Lake case. From a psychological perspective, the simultaneous disappearance of an entire community is virtually impossible without some kind of coordinated planning or external force, Dr. Morrison explained. Mass psychology doesn't support the idea that 35 people would spontaneously decide to abandon their homes and lives without any communication or preparation. Dr. Morrison's analysis ruled out the possibility of some kind of collective psychological episode or mass hysteria that might have prompted the residents to leave together. Such episodes typically involve visible signs of distress, erratic behavior, and some kind of triggering event that can be identified and analyzed. But the evidence at Kennedy Lake suggested that the residents had been going about their normal morning routines right up until the moment they disappeared. There were no signs of panic, distress, or unusual behavior that might indicate a psychological trigger for mass departure. The investigation also considered the possibility that the disappearances might be related to some kind of cult activity or religious extremism. Remote communities sometimes become involved with charismatic leaders or radical belief systems that can motivate extreme behaviors, including mass relocations or even group suicides. But investigators found no evidence that Kennedy Lake First Nation had been involved with any kind of cult, extremist group, or radical religious movement. The community practiced a combination of traditional Indigenous spirituality and mainstream Christianity, with no indication of involvement with any groups that might motivate mass departure or self-harm. Religious leaders who had worked with the community confirmed that the residents had normal, healthy spiritual lives, with no indication of extremist beliefs or involvement with dangerous groups. The upcoming salmon ceremony that Chief Klutze had been planning was a traditional cultural event that demonstrated the community's connection to normal Indigenous spiritual practices. As winter approached and the investigation entered its 6th month, the RCMP was forced to scale back the intensive search operations. While maintaining the case as an active investigation, the massive search efforts had covered thousands of square kilometers of wilderness, without finding any trace of the missing residents, and it was becoming clear that continuing the same approach was unlikely to yield different results. The families and friends of the missing residents were struggling to cope with the complete absence of information about what had happened to their loved ones. Unlike typical missing persons cases where there might be some evidence or clues to provide hope or closure, the Kennedy Lake disappearances provided absolutely nothing for families to process or understand. David Klutze was Chief Robert Klutze's older brother, who lived in Vancouver and worked as a social worker with Indigenous communities. David had visited Kennedy Lake frequently over the years and was close to many of the residents who had disappeared. He became an unofficial spokesperson for the families and worked to keep public attention focused on the case. "It's like they never existed," David Klutze told reporters during a press conference 6 months after the disappearances. "There's no evidence that they went anywhere. No sign that anything happened to them. No way to understand what we're supposed to think or feel about this situation. How do you mourn people who just vanished into nothing?" The media coverage of the Kennedy Lake disappearances was initially intense, with news outlets across Canada and internationally covering the story as one of the most baffling mysteries in modern history. But as months passed without any progress in the investigation, media attention gradually faded as other stories took precedence. The lack of new developments made it difficult for journalists to continue covering the story, and the complete absence of any evidence or clues meant that there was little substantive information to report. The case began to fade from public consciousness, even though it remained officially unsolved and active. Dr. Chen continued to be deeply affected by her discovery of the empty community, and she worked with investigators throughout the lengthy investigation process. She also attempted to continue her research project by working with other New Chanulth communities, but found it difficult to focus on academic work while the mystery of Kennedy Lake remained unsolved. "I keep thinking that I must have missed something," Dr. Chen told investigators during one of her many interviews. "There had to be some sign, some clue, some indication of what happened to these people. But I've been over every detail hundreds of times, and I can't find anything that makes sense of this situation." The Kennedy Lake community remained empty and undisturbed for months after the disappearances, with RCMP maintaining periodic patrols of the area in case the residents returned or new evidence emerged. The houses gradually took on the abandoned appearance of a ghost town, with gardens growing wild and buildings beginning to show signs of weather damage and neglect. The pets that had been left behind were cared for by animal welfare organizations, and eventually rehomed with Indigenous communities throughout Vancouver Island. The community's material possessions remained largely untouched, preserved as potential evidence in case they might eventually provide clues about the disappearances. As the first anniversary of the disappearances approached in September 2020, the RCMP announced that while the case remained active, they had exhausted all conventional investigative approaches and were unlikely to make progress without new evidence or information from witnesses. The announcement was a devastating blow to families who had hoped that intensive investigation might eventually provide answers. The one-year anniversary was marked by a memorial ceremony, organized by Nuu-chah-nulth communities across Vancouver Island to honor the missing residents and support their families. The ceremony took place at Kennedy Lake, with hundreds of people gathering to share memories, perform traditional songs and dances, and pray for the safe return of the missing community members. Elder Margaret Sam, who was Joseph Sam's sister, and lived in a nearby community, spoke at the memorial ceremony about the impact of the disappearances on Indigenous communities throughout the region. When 35 of our people vanish without a trace, it affects all of us, she said. These were our relatives, our friends, our knowledge keepers. Their loss is felt by every Indigenous person on this island. The memorial ceremony also included presentations by investigators who provided updates on the case and appealed for any new information that might help solve the mystery. But despite the extensive media coverage of the anniversary, no new leads or evidence emerged. As time passed, the Kennedy Lake disappearances began to attract attention from researchers and enthusiasts interested in anomalous phenomena and unexplained mysteries. The case was featured in documentaries about mass disappearances, discussed in online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries, and analyzed by researchers who specialized in unusual events. Some of these alternative investigators proposed theories that mainstream law enforcement had been reluctant to consider. These included possibilities such as extraterrestrial abduction, interdimensional phenomena, time travel, or other exotic explanations for the disappearances. While most professional investigators dismissed these alternative theories as science fiction, the complete absence of any conventional explanation made it difficult to rule out unconventional possibilities entirely. The Kennedy Lake case was so far outside normal parameters that it challenged standard assumptions about what kinds of events are possible in the physical world. Dr. Susan Martinez was a physicist from Simon Fraser University who became interested in the Kennedy Lake case because of the unusual electromagnetic anomalies that some investigators had reported in the area. During the initial search operations, some electronic equipment had experienced intermittent malfunctions that were difficult to explain through normal technical problems. Dr. Martinez conducted her own investigation of the Kennedy Lake area, using sophisticated instruments to measure electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and other physical phenomena that might be associated with unusual events. Her measurements detected subtle but consistent anomalies in the local electromagnetic environment that didn't match normal background conditions. There are definitely unusual electromagnetic signatures in the Kennedy Lake area, Dr. Martinez reported after several months of measurements. The patterns are consistent with some kind of high-energy event or process, but they don't match any known natural or technological phenomena. It's possible that these anomalies are related to whatever happened to the community residents. Dr. Martinez's findings provided the first potential physical evidence that something unusual had occurred in the Kennedy Lake area, even though the nature of the electromagnetic anomalies remained unexplained. Her research suggested that the disappearances might be connected to some kind of energy phenomena that was beyond current scientific understanding. The electromagnetic anomalies also correlated with reports from some of the search teams who had experienced equipment malfunctions and navigation problems while working in the Kennedy Lake area.